Philip Hockley is actually going to be coming to the Seattle area in late April to give lectures on a new view of God. Now, Philip had a transforming experience from being officially handicapped with a spinal disease, irritable bowel syndrome, and chronic fatigue to one of complete freedom. And this was based on a view of God that he'd not experienced before. Philip just recently moved to the U.S., St. Louis, from Wales, United Kingdom, and his lectures are going to be on Bainbridge Island, April 27th, Saturday at 11, and in Magnolia, Sunday, April 28th at 7 p.m. Details can be found at csbainbridge.org. That's C, S as in Sam, bainbridge.org. So welcome, Philip. I am so glad that you are here with us today.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. I feel very welcomed.
And so as I understand it, you started out with some really serious physical and emotional challenges, both through childhood and early adulthood, a bone disease as a child. And then it says that even after business success, there was still a sense of emptiness. So can you just start by sharing some of your background and then also how you coped as a child and an adult with the illnesses that you were dealing with?
Oh, I'd be happy to. And so I came from a pretty traditional background where, you know, when things go wrong in your life, you try to fix them by going to the nearest general practitioner.
Right.
And I had a number of diseases, you know, ordinary childhood diseases that most, communities are faced with for young children. But then I had a rather strange experience, which wasn't common. I had a type of arthritis in my left hip, which caused that left hip to be slightly disformed. And it didn't really affect me as a young child because I was very active and very sporty.
Mm-hmm.
But in adult life, I took a turn for the worse with some complications to do with my stomach and my digestion. And as I got weaker and weaker because of the stomach problem, the problems with the leg length then started becoming more magnified. So,
So one thing kind of stacked on top of another, and things were just cycling downhill.
Correct. Yes, there was no single cause to this period, which led me down a very long and deep path to being registered as physically handicapped. But there was a lot of contributing factors. So when I started losing weight, there was no obvious reason for it. So the doctors explored all kinds of medical avenues, all kinds of testing. They looked at my lifestyle because I'd had a life of alcohol and what we call soft drugs in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
I was smoking, marijuana, and I was addicted to nicotine. And so they were looking to the lifestyle choices as probably being a cause for some kind of stomach damage or stomach imbalance. Mm-hmm. And that was explaining why I was losing weight. Mm-hmm. But now, after a couple of years of giving up all of these poor lifestyle kind of contributors, I was still getting sicker and sicker. So then they did all the testing that they needed to for things like tropical diseases, because I had traveled all over the world as a merchant seaman. Still, they came up with nothing. They found a couple of stomach bugs and intestinal parasites, which they were unable to eradicate. Mm-hmm. But they couldn't say this was definitively the reason why you're losing so much weight. Mm. Mm. And so I went from being a really active and healthy sports person. I mean, I taught skiing in the European Alps in Austria and Switzerland in the winter months. And in the summer months, I taught water sports and water safety at youth camps in the Mediterranean. So I was incredibly active and fit. And then to suddenly start losing weight uncontrollably, it just made a huge impact on my life.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it must have been terrifying. And at the same time, to be an active, engaged, sports and outdoors enthusiast, and to have this happening to your body and you're losing the contact with the people in sports and things that you love. Yeah. And then at the same time, having kind of that underlying fear, most likely, of like, why is this happening to me and why can't they find answers?
Yeah, it was actually a feeling of being really disempowered. I felt like for the first time in my life, instead of me running and ruling the body, it felt like the body was now ruling me. And it was really scary.
Yeah, I can only imagine. And so after you went through the medical tests and tried all of that, I mean, did you wind up also exploring religious and alternative types of therapies as well?
Yes, so a couple of acquaintances of mine had experience of the mind, body, spirit community that
Hmm.
was starting to take off and become more popular.
Hmm.
So when the doctors, who really tried their very best, I mean, they pulled out all the stops for me and got me all the best care that I could possibly ask for. But when they said, there's no, we have no alternative for you, I then went to alternative therapies.
Yeah.
And so I spent about 4 years exploring literally, and I mean literally, the A to Z of therapies. I went from acupuncture all the way through to zone therapy. And I did everything in
Oh my
between,
gosh.
literally. So I was unable to work at that time. So I was able to liquidate all my assets. I sold off my possessions. I cashed in all my savings. And I literally traveled around Britain and Europe, meeting and practicing with these alternative therapy practitioners. And it was an incredible voyage of discovery for me, but still I was getting sicker. I wasn't getting a cure.
Oh my gosh. I mean, that must have been like the feeling of abject frustration.
It was, it was a period of deep, deep lows and very big highs, because every time I would speak to an alternative therapist, they were also confident that their particular approach could be the key that I was looking for.
Right.
And then I would commit myself fully to it. I would, put myself under their system,
Hmm.
and still they at the end would say, well, we're sorry, there's nothing more we can do.
Oh, and it must have been, did you find that as you've done some of these, and then as you get to, maybe the fourth or fifth or 10th alternative therapy, did you find yourself feeling less hopeful as you approach these different things after a while? Like, I mean, why is nothing working?
I can honestly say I didn't feel hopeless. I just thought, there's going to be a solution to this at some point. And I had this vague belief that there was life after death. And because I'd experienced, like, my dad died when he was only 28 years of age.
Hmm.
And because I'd experienced the death of other loved ones in my family, and I felt intuitively that they must be still existing somewhere,
Hmm.
I just kind of reasoned, so what? If this body kills me, I'll still live somewhere afterwards, and I'll be out of pain. So it actually wasn't such a bad prospect.
Well, it sounds like you had a better mindset than some, and definitely one that helped you get through that. So then what happened? You've done these therapies, nothing has worked as you'd hoped it would.
Yeah.
What happened?
So at that point, I realized that, I was losing so much weight that it was becoming dangerously affecting my organs were starting to shut down. My normal functions were starting to shut down. And so I contacted some monasteries. I thought I was going to die, and I thought it was going to be soon, because the doctors said you can't keep losing weight.
Right.
And I just thought, innocently, I just thought, if I'm going to meet God, I better get to know what he or she looks like so I can be polite when I meet them, So I thought, go to the monks and try and find out about God before you die. And I hadn't had a good experience, unfortunately, with the Christians in my village. Had not been particularly kind people to me, so I'd always had this aversion to Christians. But I eventually went to a Christian monastery and said, look, can you help me? And they said, sorry, you're too sick. I contacted the Buddhist monastery, and they said, come as you are. So I thought, great, somebody's going to help me. And what I learned there became absolutely vital in those last 2 years before I came in contact with that healing lecture in 2001. They taught me a form of mindful meditation, mindfulness, which allowed me to pass my awareness throughout the body, experiencing the pain and the discomfort, but not reacting to it. They taught me that there's two types of suffering. There's the bodily suffering, which is when you're in pain, but you also then, if you react mentally, you have a mental suffering. So there's two lots of suffering bothering you. So they were trying to teach me to feel the sensations, but not react to them. So then the mental suffering would be reduced to the point where I didn't suffer mentally. And it was exactly my experience.
So, okay, I was just going to say, and so that worked for you. And so then you were going through this, and this is what you were learning through the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Okay.
So I called it my happy mind broken body period, because I was still getting sicker. Every time I went to do these silent retreats, I was weaker and lighter. At the end, just before I came in contact with Christian Science, I was 105 pounds.
Oh, my word.
My usual body weight was about 185 pounds. So this was a significant, situation I was in, and it was pretty life-threatening.
Yes.
Every time I went to the Buddhist retreats, I was getting weaker and weaker, but my mind was becoming detached from all the pain.
Mm-hmm.
So I was happier in myself, but my body was still, as my brother said, you were circling the drain, he said. You were ready to drop out. I looked shocking.
Yes. Well, I can relate, because as a 5'6" woman, when I had a serious illness many years ago, I had mono, and I weighed 105, and I looked like death. And I can only extrapolate what a strong, strapping 185-pound man who's done these sports and so forth at that same weight. It's mind-boggling. I mean, I picture it, and it's frightening.
Yeah, some people said, even the people that met me at the lecture, they said, you look like an 80-year-old man. And I was 35 years of age.
Well, that must have been a little discouraging, but you were feeling less mental suffering, so that was better. So then you're going through this, you're still losing the weight. So then what was the transforming step?
So I saw an advert for a lecture, which looked like it was a history lecture. And because it looked like it was a history lecture, I was eventually able to go to it without any resistance. But what I found out when I got to the lecture, as soon as I got there, I actually found out that it was a Christian Science lecture sponsored by the local church in that community, and it was a lecture on healing. So my first reaction was I was horrified that it was a Christian lecture, because it hadn't made it obvious on the poster, I didn't think. And I'd had this strong distaste for people that called themselves Christians ever since my upbringing, because I had some rough experiences at the hands of Christians. So they called themselves Christians. Maybe they were just not acting on it. I don't know. But what I felt when I got to the lecture was, if these people are Christians, I don't want to be in this room. And then the lecture started by mentioning the promise of healing that's given as laws throughout the Bible. And I thought, oh my goodness, not only are they Christians, but they think they can heal me. Because about 5 years earlier, before I went to the monasteries, I had contacted every single Christian denomination in my community. I went to the Yellow Pages, before Google.
Yes.
Pages. So I Googled all the local churches, and all of them said, yes, we have healing services. Either come along or we will come out to you. And that's what they did. All the churches offered me healing services and healing prayers, and still I wasn't improving. So that was before I went to the monasteries. So I'm thinking to myself, what do these people think they've got that's going to heal me that the other Christians couldn't heal me?
Right.
So I really wasn't that interested at all in what this lady had to say.
I can understand that. So did you have the sense that you wanted to flee the room, or did she suddenly then say something that caught your attention and you thought, maybe I should stay?
Yeah, so I really wanted to flee the room. In fact, because I'd never gone, I'd only lived in this city for 2 years when I became a Buddhist and moved away from my family. And this part of the city was more than my walking distance away from my apartment. So I'd never been there, because I could only walk about 200 or 300 yards before all my joints would start swelling, and then I'd have to sit down and rest. So I'd never gone to this place because it was maybe half a mile away from my apartment. So to get to the lecture, I had to walk I went through the Central Park in this city called Hereford in England. And the Central Park happened to have park benches about every 200 or 300 meters on this footpath. So I would walk 200 or 300 meters, sit down exhausted. I'd let my legs, calm down and the swelling would go down. Then I'd walk another 200 meters to the next bench. So when I got to the lecture, I was in a lot of discomfort. I'd walked further than I had in maybe 2 or 3 years. So my legs were swollen and throbbing, and I just wanted to get up and leave, but I couldn't, because I was literally trapped in a painful, inflamed body. So I had to kind of grin and bear it. I thought, I'll grin and bear it for 15 or 20 minutes, then I'll get up and I'll just leave and make a bit of a scene. And it was then that things started to change, when I realized I couldn't leave. And the way that I've described it after this event, I've got the benefit of hindsight now. I'll describe it to you as best I can. But At the time, I just noticed that while I had this kind of human nagging voice saying, oh, what do they know? Oh, they've no idea what my suffering's like. Oh, these Christians are probably very well off and they don't care about their community. I mean, I was having all these unnecessary opinions and judgments.
Mm-hmm.
Then I started to become aware of a far greater sense of consciousness. It was literally like somebody had taken the lid off my head, and I was experiencing this incredibly vast form of thinking. And the way that I describe it, some of the listeners may have had this experience when they fly from an airfield on a rainy day, that you taxi along the runway and it's pouring with rain, and you take off, and then within a couple of minutes you might have pierced those rain clouds, and just above it, it's just crystal clear blue skies in all directions. Yes.
Yes.
I had experienced that myself many times. Living in Britain, you often take off on a rainy day, you know.
Seattle too. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I think Wales and Seattle tend to have similar weather, I'm told. So it was literally like there was a part of my consciousness which was nagging and critical. And then there was this part of my conscious, it was like blue sky. It was just vast and incredibly peaceful. And I started noticing that I felt incredibly loved at the same time. It was the oddest experience I'd ever come across, because there was nobody in the room that I felt affection for. There was nobody in the room that was known to me like a mother or a brother or a cousin, a girlfriend. I knew nobody in this venue, and yet I felt this incredible sense of love pressing in on me. So as this became pretty all-consuming, I suddenly remembered, oh, pass your awareness through the body and don't react. So that's what I did. I practiced that meditation technique. And as I'm passing my awareness through the body, it literally felt like all the stiffness, the inflammation, the disease, and the discomfort that I brought with me to the lecture, it literally felt like it was melting before my very eyes. I mean, you take an ice cube from the freezer tray, you place it on a sunny windowsill, and when you place that on the sunny windowsill, the first thing that happens is the sun will start melting those sharp corners of the ice cube, won't it? Right?
Right.
If you leave it on a sunny windowsill long enough, the whole ice cube will melt into a puddle. And if you leave it even longer, it'll just evaporate and there'll be no sign of it. This is exactly what was happening to the sensations in my body while I was sitting in this lecture. The pain and the stiffness, it was all just literally evaporating as I was passing my awareness through the body, and I was completely blown away by it. So much so that the only thing that brought me to my senses is when everybody started clapping to mark the end of that hour lecture. And I hadn't heard a word that that lecturer had said. I was just in another place mentally. And that was the transforming experience that I then had to go away and start trying to work out why there had been such a tremendous improvement in my well-being, complete healing, there and then, after all those years of seeking and still finding nothing.
So after you attended that lecture and you experienced that sensation, I mean, what happened? Did you know intuitively that you'd been completely healed? Did you just start to improve? I mean, what was your experience after that?
Okay. So leaving the lecture, it had taken me an hour and a half to walk from my apartment to this lecture. When I left the lecture, I walked out of the venue, down the steps, and straight back to my house in about 7 or 8 minutes. I was walking as freely as the skiing instructor that I'd been 15, 20 years before. I walked in a pain-free body, and when I got home, I literally felt like it was almost like I'd been completely renewed. And I was so unable to process this that I just went straight to bed and fell asleep. When I woke up in the morning, I noticed that because my left hip had been deformed as a child, I had a heel lift in every left shoe. And when I got up from the bed in the morning, I noticed my legs were the same length because I no longer had this one leg shorter than the other. I noticed that my legs were the same length without putting the shoes on. The heel lift was helping this leg length discrepancy, and the leg length discrepancy had caused the spine to lean in the opposite direction, and that was the scoliosis. And that scoliosis was the bit that was dislocating regularly and causing me so much pain. When I woke up the morning after the lecture, my back felt straight, my legs felt the same height, the same length, and I had no pain whatsoever in my spine. And this was really incredible and pretty hard for me to accept, because I've gone down every single medical route, every single alternative therapy route. I had never heard of healings that could literally transform you in the twinkling of an eye. But that is exactly how it felt. And it stayed like that until this day.
That is absolutely incredible. And I have heard of things like this happening, but I think until it happens to you, it seems like something that you're thinking, okay, it must have been in their head. It must have been in their mind.
Yeah.
This wasn't real. It's propaganda someone's putting out, all those things that go through. So
Yeah.
why do you think you were healed, and how can that help others?
So the first thing I thought was it couldn't have been through faith, because I had no faith in Christianity at all. I had no idea that I was going to a healing event. I'd actually given up on healing 2 years earlier when I took the vows to be a monk. You know, I'd given up all my family connections. I'd given up all my worldly possessions, and I was literally meditating to a peaceful death. That's all I was doing.
Right.
So there was no sense of faith. There was no prior knowledge. In fact, there was a lot of irritation towards the Christian message, if I'm being honest. So what I discovered at that point was this must be something which is beyond the human mind, because I couldn't have asked for it. And also it appears I couldn't have stopped it. And I started trying to study what had gone on by going to this church. So most Christian Science churches around the world, they have this brilliant facility called a reading room. And it's like a public library, often on the high street or close to their church. And you can go in there Monday to Friday. You can study the Bible. You can study about Christian Science. So the very next day after the lecture, I made a beeline for this reading room because I needed to find out what had happened the night before. And when I got there, I started studying what they call the weekly Bible lesson. And what they do is they give passages from the Bible on one side of the page, and then they give passages from a book that was called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. And this book, Science and Health, it unlocks sometimes obscure Bible passages and helps you to make them practical in your daily life. So I started reading and studying about what Christian Science is standing for. And the more I was reading and studying, the more it was answering the questions that I had from that transforming experience at that night in the lecture.
And I mean, do you think that you were picked for a reason, or was this something that would be available to anyone and it just happened to be your time? I mean, because I'm sure there are people that are listening wondering, well, I've had chronic pain for years, or I've been dealing with this particular ailment or disease. And I know that you are going to be giving a lecture. I mean, and so will you be discussing this? And why should someone attend? I mean, what will they find?
Yeah, I'm very happy to mention that the first discoveries that I had in those days and weeks after that healing was that these are in law. They're laws written in the Bible, and they are just as unconditional as the radio waves that your station is broadcasting out to your community. Now, those radio waves that you're broadcasting, they pass through the bricks and beams, the windows of every single building in your community. You know, you can listen to the radio in the bathroom, you can listen to it on the kitchen windowsill. Those radio waves are passing through every material structure in your community. And when you place your hand over the antenna of a pocket radio, it proves that the radio waves actually pass through the fibers of your being as well. Yes? It literally passes through us. So what I realized was at that lecture, I became conscious of something that I'd never been conscious of before because my material senses did not support its presence. So just like now, I've got no evidence of what's being broadcast from my local radio station in St. Louis. If I picked up my radio and switched it on, you and I could both listen to the broadcast that's coming right through the bricks and beams of my house. It's coming right through the fiber of my being, but it's undetected by the material senses. And what Christian Science is teaching is that there are material senses, but there is a higher sense called spiritual sense. And that spiritual sense is a description for what Jesus called the Christ in you, your hope of glory. So it's almost as if there are laws that God created his perfect creation in his image and likeness. In the very first book of Genesis, it's described as God making man and women in his image and likeness. And then later in the Bible, you get promises that God is the law of life, truth, and love for every part of his creation. So because these laws may seem invisible, just like the laws of the radio waves that we rely on so much, just like Wi-Fi, none of us can see the Wi-Fi in the house. We can't feel it, but we can certainly connect to it when we put Wi-Fi onto our mobile devices. What Jesus seemed to be teaching is we are living and moving and breathing in an entirely spiritual universe. And because God made this universe and declared everything to be good, very good, we must be able to experience that broadcast of good for ourselves.
So it's like turning on the radio, and this is what this can actually help do.
Yes.
And I'm realizing that we are almost out of time. This has been fascinating. I'm sure that anyone listening would love to hear more. So just very briefly, in about 10 or 15 seconds. So what do you do now? I mean, are you back to teaching sports, or are you traveling on the lecture circuit? What do you do now?
Yeah, so ever since that healing, it took me a while to come to terms with it. And the more I studied what Christian Science teaches, the more I became knowledgeable about it, the more people came to me and said, would you help me because I need a healing as well? So I would help people, first of all, by praying for them, the same way that church in Hereford prayed that somebody from the community would be healed by coming to the lecture. I would pray with people, but then the more I was able to explain this, the more I got invited to give talks to groups of people that wanted to learn about this. And then eventually, a few years later, there is a board of lectureship that's sponsored by the church that goes around the world giving free lectures all year round. And there are free lectures all over the world, even this weekend. There'll be free lectures in cities and towns all over this country, all over Europe, Australia, Canada, you name it. They'll be all over the world. So that's what I do mostly now as I travel the world giving these lectures.
Well, I can see why, because it's fascinating. And I so appreciate you sharing this amazing story with us. I'm sure that there are going to be people who are going to want to come and hear you or learn more. It's most definitely fascinating. So once again, Philip Hockley will be speaking in the Seattle area on April 27th and 28th on Bainbridge Island and in Magnolia. He'll also be that week speaking in Aberdeen, Washington, and in Bremerton. So if you go to csbainbridge.org, there will be more information about his speaking engagements, and you can hear more about his stories. So again, thank you for joining us. A fascinating transformation. I am so happy that you turned the corner and experienced this amazing restoration of health, and we'll look forward to hearing more.
Thank you so much, Marilyn, and I wish the same for every single listener. I promise you.
All right. You have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you so much, and you. Bye-bye.
Bye.